everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Language Lounge. My name is Michelle Ola, and today I have Matt Coss with me to talk about novice language learners, and with a special twist, right, Matt?
That's right.
Awesome. We're going to talk about, I love the title of the presentation that kind of prompted this discussion, which was, I don't know, you'll correct me exactly, but it's basically that, novice language doesn't mean novice brains, right? Or novice. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that is so important. I think it's something, as I was a Spanish 1 teacher forever, that is, you struggle, right? It's hard to do this. So I just appreciate you being here today to talk a little bit about this, share some tips and ideas. But before we start, why don't you just kind of introduce yourself? Tell us a little about where you are, your language teaching and learning journey would be great. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation, for having me. I'm really happy to be here talking about, world language stuff is what I do even in my free time. So, to be able to talk about it with enthusiastic friends is always a fun thing. Yeah, sure. So my name is Matt. I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was born and raised until I was 18. I did my undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill, and I double majored in Hispanic linguistics and in Asian studies, which is just really Chinese. I have a master's degree in second language acquisition from the University of Maryland, and spent 4.5 years, 2 during my master's and 2 after, working at the National Foreign Language Center, which is also at the University of Maryland. So for those in the audience familiar with Star Talk, for example, that's a program and a project that I worked really closely with for a long time. And then I am now a PhD student at Michigan State University in the Second Language Studies program, which is sort of another way of saying second language acquisition. And then language teaching. So the long and short of it is I had my first job sort of as a language teacher when I was actually only 16 years old. I was a high school student, and my school had a teacher go out on medical leave, and they couldn't find a sub or a member of the staff to cover one section of her class. So I was a junior in high school, and one day I got approached and they asked me if I felt comfortable teaching a Spanish 2, an IB Spanish 2 class. And of course, 16-year-old me, who's a proficient Spanish speaker, was like, how hard can it be to teach a language? No problem. Like, yeah, I can do that. I was smart, fantastic. Though. I negotiated well for myself. So they had an adult in the room at all times, like a sub, often who didn't speak Spanish, though. And I actually managed to negotiate my way out of not only my first period class, so I taught Spanish every day on a block schedule for 1 semester, but I got myself out of my second period class too, so I got a planning period.
That's fantastic.
Pretty cool. Looking back at 16 to have figured that out, I think, I was like, wow, I paid attention to my teachers, at least, I think. But that gave me a sort of redirected my path. One, I thought I was going to be like a business, international consulting kind of translator. I don't know what I was planning to do, but it wasn't teaching. And then it sort of
That's great.
humbled me profoundly in high school to realize, just how hard it was. I was like, I know Spanish and I know how I learned it. And I'm watching how these students are or are not learning it. And I'm like frustrated, but also super excited and really trying to just wrap my mind around, how do I do this in a way that it works? What works? So 16, redirected life trajectory and sort of decided I want to teach languages. So in college, I taught undergraduate Spanish classes. I also taught for 2 years at the medical school at UNC Chapel Hill. So I taught very advanced learners who were, soon to be doctors. So we did quite a bit of sort of situational, really intricate, getting to, high level interpersonal communication kinds of things. And then after college, I spent a little over a year teaching at a language school that I had previously been involved with for many years, where I was teaching adults. So people all the way from college age students up to retirees. And then I went and did my master's and had some time teaching. I taught for almost an entire school year in an elementary Chinese immersion program in Washington, D.C. I started teaching Chinese at Georgetown University. So I taught at Georgetown for 2 years, and I've been at George Washington University now for 3 years teaching Chinese. So I have did Spanish teaching for a while, and have been away from it for a while, which I really miss it, but have been teaching Chinese for quite a few years. I left out the summer intensive language learning with middle and high schoolers that I did for many years too. But so kind of small amounts of time. I'm pretty young, I suppose. But, I've sort of gotten to dabble with language learners at kind of every age and stage, which is pretty cool.
That's amazing. So it would have been a lot quicker if I would have just asked you, what haven't you done, right? What haven't you taught? No, that's amazing though. But I love that, that experience with all those different, like you said, from adults and professionals and elementary and all of that. I find I know I've worked, and again, not nearly as extensive in different areas as that, but the more you add different layers and different people into that, it's the same, but it's not, right? I mean,
exactly.
There's commonalities, but then there's things that are so different. And then you can transfer those amazing things from one context and go, oh, let's see what it looks like in a different way for a different audience.
Totally. And what's really interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into this with today's topic, and I'm sure I will mention this dear friend and colleague more than once today, but something a dear friend of mine who's also a Spanish teacher currently in a middle school in Charlotte, Rose Rhodes, one of the things she and I talk about all the time is how, in so many ways, elementary school language teachers really have it figured out. They, in terms of pace, in terms of having to make themselves comprehensible, in terms of not being able to sort of pretend to rely on lots of sort of grammar driven, sort of syllabus, if you will, for a course, teaching language, but also teaching content, like really
differentiation, addressing special needs.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so true.
I wish everybody got to teach, not had to perhaps, but got to teach, or at least got to watch our elementary school world language colleagues, because I think they have it figured out in a way that benefited me, before and after that, with people as old as retirees,
Yeah, I agree 100%. When I taught at the secondary level, and then I worked in a district office, and I mostly worked originally with secondary. And then we had the great opportunity to have an elementary program come into place. And long story short, I was their coach and administrator, and I got to be in elementary world language, Chinese, French, German, Spanish classrooms every day. And I learned more about language teaching and what good instruction looks like, and engagement and all of those things by working with those teachers. And so it's funny, even now I'm the president of NEL, the National Network for Early Language Learning, even though I never taught elementary and I'm not involved in elementary anymore, but it is such an amazing group of professionals. And you are right. I think we do need to pay attention to what they say, because there is a lot of great things going on. So I love that. We can talk more about that. So I agree 100%. So introduce this topic to me today, what we're going to talk about. I saw this, I believe it was Scholt that you did it, correct? Yeah. So I saw it in the program, but I was busy and I couldn't go. And so I selfishly reached out and said, hey, Matt, do you want to do this on the podcast? Because I would love to talk to you, pick your brain about this. So tell us the topic, tell us the title, and kind of how this came about and why this is important that you really want to talk about.
So it was an invited workshop at Scholt. So shout out to Scholt, which is, I at least, and we were just talking about this, you move out of your region or your state, but you sort of feel like, I live in the Midwest now, but every year I'm like, I want to go back to Scholt. I want to go back to Flank, which is the North Carolina state organization, right? I'm like, those are my roots. Those are my home. Those are my people. So the invitation came through from a colleague at Scholt to do a workshop. And I thought, of course, I absolutely will come. I didn't get to travel back down south, unfortunately, but we did it virtually and it was great. So the topic of the workshop was novice level language, not novice level brains, engaging and empowering learners. And the sort of underlying thinking. So there's this great scene for members of the audience who have ever watched the show Modern Family, which is, great sitcom kind of show. Sofia Vergara's character has this one scene that always stood out to me. I mean, I remember it so clearly the first time I saw it. She's like yelling at her family about something and she says, do you even know how smart I am in Spanish? And, of course, being pretty young, maybe the first time it didn't strike quite the same chord. But over the years, listening to so many sort of thought leaders in our field and doing some research myself and engaging sort of with teachers on the ground and scholars in the academy and sort of everybody working towards this goal of how do we make language learning and teaching better, more equitable, more effective, more whatever, there's this tendency that we tend to have, I think, as humans, not perhaps so much as language teachers, but as language users, humans, we often reduce like the complexity and the intelligence of other humans to their language abilities, right? We decide that somebody is only as smart as they can language. And if they don't language in English, for example, we don't assume that they might have a PhD or that they might be a doctor, like a medical doctor, or they might be a lawyer, or they might be, this complex human whose life is no less complicated and rich than our own. But because they don't language in a way that we can understand, we simplify them. And I think one of the biggest challenges when there's a gap between the sort of cognitive level and life experience of a language learner and their language abilities, we as teachers really sometimes struggle to help them language in a way that doesn't insult their life experience. And I have struggled with that for years, right? So I ran this gambit sort of back and forth between all these different age groups. And while in so many ways, language teaching is language teaching in the sense that people need input and they need to be able to understand, and you need to be engaging. And if they're not paying attention, they're probably not learning. And, all of those sort of big things hold true. It's very different to engage with the same content in some ways with, a 6-year-old and a 60-year-old. So it's sort of, can we find ways to accomplish the goal of, novice level language teaching and then moving them out of that is not intellectually insulting?
Yeah. I 100%. I think that's a good word for it. And I don't think that we often notice that we're even doing that. Right. I was horrified at one point early in my career, and I was a Spanish speaker was talking, and somebody realized they weren't, they were speaking in English, and it was a little bit, their proficiency level was good, but not perfect, and the other person stopped talking and then started talking louder and slower. And you're just like, no. Right. But I think we tend to do that. Like, they're not hard of hearing. You don't have to speak louder. You don't need to speak slower. You can still have Yeah, it's hard. And I think you're right. Like, we need to check ourselves a lot, because I think it is a human thing to some extent. It's not, meant to be, it's not intentionally insulting. We're not trying to be that way, but yeah, I think stopping and asking ourselves, and then having strategies, right? Like, and that's what we're going to talk about. Like, how do we do this in a respectful way? Right.
Yeah. So one of the examples that I sort of led with this workshop that, from my own experience, right, we think about, there's so many teachers and, textbooks and units and whatever that are related in some way to like health, right? And then in the health unit, inevitably, you're going to get at, the need to talk about your body, maybe your body parts for various purposes, right? My head hurts, my whatever. So you'll get people who are like looking for comprehensible input. So they play head, shoulders, knees, and toes. And they want the kids to like sing along and whatever. And in elementary school, sure. In 6th grade, they will do it. But when they hit that 7th grade transition, for whatever reason, they're too cool for it now. They're like, whoa, that's little kid stuff, right? Like, so how do you get the same content in a way that doesn't make them go, that's little kid stuff? I tell my college students all the time that some of the best sort of purely language input in terms of comprehensibility, in terms of repetitiveness, sort of, ability to be anticipated, right? You can predictability, that's the word, is like young kids' cartoons, right? Cartoons are repetitive. They're sort of in the here and now. They're not displaced in time and space. And then you get students, right, who will go sit in the library and watch Peppa Pig in Chinese, and they'll be really happy about it. But then other students are like, I'm not watching that. That's for 3-year-olds. And I'm like, right. And you're 21, and you're sort of age and pride and life experience is rebelling against this thing that I'm trying to do for language learning.
Mm-hmm.
And this mismatch, if it works, great. But if it doesn't, then what am I just going to say? Well, too bad you won't watch Peppa Pig. I guess you can't learn Chinese. No, it's on me to then think about what else is possible. What else can we do? And that's definitely been a challenge. It continues to be a challenge, I think. Teaching college students who are novice language learners, they don't need to learn their colors, right? Like conceptually, they don't need to learn colors. But how do we make communication about, that is going to incorporate, if this is language that has to be taught for whatever reason,
correct, right?
How do we incorporate it in a way that's not just, as my old advisor used to say, I'm a book, you're a book, everybody's a book. That's not that repetitive sort of display question. What color is my shirt? Like, we don't ask those questions in normal, communication.
Right. We can just point to our shirt, right? We don't have to.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are some suggestions, some things that you've learned, you've heard? I know that, one of the things I loved about your description in the program was also that this is a conversation. This is a brainstorming, right? This is things you don't just come up with all of these things yourself. You talk to other teachers and you communicate, right? So what are some things that you, or some examples you can share of how we can all do this better?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I would start by saying that, it's important to me to cite my sources, right? It's really important. I think it's easy to not do that. And we sort of feel like all of our ideas, we're like working in this collective, especially on places like social media, this like collective shared space. And it's easy to sort of take an idea and then share it with somebody else, well-meaning, right? In a way that you're like, I just want to get this great idea out into the world. So there's going to be ideas all throughout, this sort of stuff that we talked about that day in the workshop. But I figured it'd be good to go ahead and shout out some people.
That's awesome.
That, we're citing the sources and then we'll continue to cite them as we go. But
and you can give me a list and I can cite those in the show notes as well. Anybody else that we want to give credit to, because you're right. We want to, sometimes well-meaning, we're well-meaning, but we don't always do that. We don't always know where that original idea and thought came from.
Exactly.
So I love that.
Let's see. So there's some elementary school colleagues that I learned a lot from on social media. So you have Dory Conlon Perugini in Connecticut and Francois Thenu, who was in Philadelphia last I knew. But both of them work in elementary school and do a ton of really great work with sort of this meaningful communication and critical thinking, critical awareness, anti-racism, all this great stuff, even with elementary school students. And they share very freely on Twitter too. So two of them, they have informed this thinking, to be sure. I mentioned Rose Rhodes a minute ago. I'm going to cite some of her stuff here in a minute. There's so many people. There's people in universities like LJ Randolph, who was in North Carolina and like me is a Tar Heel who's coming to the Midwest very soon. There's the sort of the thought leaders of our world, some of whom are still language teachers, some of whom are perhaps not language teachers anymore, but still contributing. So you get Uju Anya is a name that jumps out to me. Stacey Johnson, Nelson Flores, Jonathan Drosa. There was somebody else who just popped into my brain, Jose Medina. So there's lots of people on Twitter who are who I feel like I've absorbed these ideas from slowly over time that have sort of coalesced here in some of the thoughts that I was able to share with some colleagues at Skoll. But so wanted to give some shout outs first, and then we'll continue to shout them out as
I
we
love
go through.
that. I love that. We'll try and tag them all on Twitter after this is done too.
Perfect.
Because they are all amazing people for sure to follow.
Yeah. I mean, just people that it's Twitter is one of those spaces, right, where sometimes we feel conflicted about, do I want to spend all of this time on social media? And I have been tempted many a time to say, I'm not going to be on social media anymore. But then I encounter these people who share so freely. And if we weren't on Twitter, we wouldn't have connected. And I'm like, maybe I'll stay.
Yeah.
So, thankful for these people who keep me on Twitter, to be sure.
For sure.
A couple other names I want to not forget are so former colleagues of mine at the National Foreign Language Center who are like some of the PD geniuses of our field. You have Laura Terrell, who probably was the first person to really push me in curriculum design to sort of think beyond the language into sort of where are we getting the critical thinking from. There's lots of ideas around images that I learned from Laura that I'll talk about. And Thomas Sauer was always on that team and was always asking me really hard questions that I generally never knew the answer to. But
Thomas is
looking
really
back,
good
I'm
at
grateful.
that.
He's really, really good at the hard questions,
really
and I appreciate
is.
him for that.
I agree.
So Thomas directed me once to, I think he got it from Katrina Griffin, I'm pretty sure, because I see her talking about them often. But one of the things that I've started to do in my classes probably 4 years ago now that I love are these, they're called thinking routines. They're from Project 180 at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And they weren't designed for world language. So they didn't initiate in world language. They started as these routines for critical thinking. And some of the ones that are probably familiar to many of us are things like think, pair, share. But one of my favorites is, you get like, I used to think, but now I know.
I love that.
Another one that I love is see, think, wonder. And one of the things that I think that sort of was a thread throughout my talk was using images, because I think images, something I learned from Laura a long time ago, is images sort of let your brain do what it's going to do, even if your language can't quite get there, right? You can engage in critical thinking and be thinking all of these thoughts, have all this background knowledge active, and have all of these, possibilities sort of swimming around your mind, even if what you end up producing in terms of language is really simple. And probably the first example of this I ever saw when I was 16 and sort of looking for inspiration for my very first Spanish class was this presentation that used to be online, and unfortunately I can't find it anymore, but Helena Curtin did this awesome presentation, and one of the things she showed was from an elementary school kid who put up a picture of a jaguar, from the Amazon, and they captioned the picture in Spanish, "No soy un abrigo," I'm not a coat. And the language, super simple, right? Like that's very great. What we would say Spanish 1. It's very simple, present tense, nothing fancy going on there. But the depth of knowledge and thinking that I'm not a coat reflects as a caption for an endangered animal is huge, right? Yeah. And is much more than my coat is black, right? Same language, but a very different depth of thinking. So, all the way back there had me thinking, okay, pictures might be a thing we can really rely on. So see, think, wonder is one of my favorites. And it is what it sounds like. It's kind of a 3-phase process. You put an image or a text or whatever. I like images because every level can use images. And you start with sort of a list of what do you see? And it can be just that simple. You as the teacher can kind of elicit more language, right? You can ask for details. You can ask for what color is the thing? Where is it? What is it next to, right? You can push for more rich language, but that really is kind of a brainstorming session. Think is then making opinion sort of statements based on the observations. I think this person is doing this. I think this person is feeling this kind of way. I think these people are about to go do whatever. And then wonder is asking questions, right? So you observe sort of surface level, what are all the things you see? Interpret, what do you think about them? And then end with what else could be going on here? What are other possibilities? So that's the kind of canonical order. That's the order that it comes from on the Project Zero website. But I've actually found a lot of success inverting step 2 and step 3. So I do see, wonder, think for like 3 reasons. One is because I don't think we spend enough time sort of asking questions. I think we talk about it a lot and say intermediate level learners need to be able to
I was just thinking the same thing. Yeah.
But we don't do it, and it's hard to do it organically, right? It's hard to do it in a way that's not just like, ask the person next to you, what's their name? Right. And you're like, I've known this person since first grade. Like, I didn't know their name. Like, so it's hard when if we're the generators and the source of the responses all the time, it gets boring. So having an image, sort of an external to the people in the room, source of inspiration can be useful. So 1, it's sort of question generation with some novelty. 2, I think questions are less threatening than opinions. Because then it's okay to be wrong because it's a question.
Yeah,
I like that. And then 3, you get a little bit like you kind of avoid maybe 2 related negative consequences of opinion statements. One being, somebody in class disagrees and is like, well, you're wrong. And then you kind of derails the whole thing because we're communicating, right? We're talking and somebody's like, I disagree. And it goes sideways. Or you kind of get a rabbit hole. You avoid the rabbit hole of somebody says this thing and that takes the conversation in a direction that then leaves a lot of stuff on the table. So I really like see, wonder, think. I like it in that order. I'm sure there's good reasons and research why it was in the other order, but that's one for me that, again, you can get at really simple, you can get really simple language that reflects or that pushes people to have really deep thoughts. So, I'll put up like advertisements. And I remember one that I use with students all the time to show how different Pizza Hut is in China versus in the US. So in China, Pizza Hut is like a sit-down restaurant. In the US, it is not. Yeah. And we look at this Pizza Hut ad and it's like 6 friends sitting around a table with like all this food piled up all over the table. And, some of the questions that my students will ask is like, how much does this all cost? Can they eat all of the food? Right. So then we're getting at questions like food waste and responsible consumption, but we're talking about, we're talking about a picture and we're just asking questions. They can think all of these answers. We can even scaffold the answers if we really want them, but it really is getting the language that we want and getting the brain engaged. And even if those things aren't quite happening at the same level, as long as they're both happening, you sort of feel satisfied on both levels. It's kind of the idea.
Yeah. And
so that's one.
And I love that idea too. The pictures that we show can really make a difference, and again, I want to say it was Lara Terrell, but I don't know. I'm probably crediting her instead somebody else. But I remember when we were talking about, they were showing a unit about food. And again, you can show generic food on a table, or you can show food in a supermarket with lots of choice in the US and a different sort of way of shopping, and what those things imply from those pictures is what's, again, it's deep, it's very, nuanced, it's bringing to some deeper sort of consumption issues, and a lot of things, choice, lots of different things you can get from that. But again, the language can be, I see, I see this food, I see it over here too, but it's a whole different context. And I love that idea of it doesn't have to be complicated. But you can bring these things in just in very easy kind of ways, right? Just looking at the images. I love that.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess one, word of caution, I would say one that I think a lot of colleagues have been pointing out that I really appreciate this sort of constant reminder is to critically examine the things we choose, right? The pictures that we choose. And to remember and sort of engage openly and honestly with our students, even if it means a minute or two of a shared language that's not the target language, that, this one picture is not representative of everybody's lifestyle, and that we're not, we shouldn't take this and apply this as the norm to everyone, which is why I love Stacey Johnson often talks about using individual people, like the biography almost of an actual person. And that she's even done, I think she published a paper not that long ago talking about sort of what you get when you're interacting with the idea of an individual versus sort of an amorphous group. And you get a lot more sort of sympathy, empathy, seeing commonalities, and avoiding sort of the group level stereotypes, which I think is really hard to do at the novice level if you're not being intentional about it, which kind of leads me to this other thing that we talked about in this workshop that I love to do. And Rhodes and I, one time we were on our way back. I think we were on our way back from a conference on the West Coast, and we sat on a plane and based on this conversation, like sketched out an entire unit that then we both went back and did with our respective students, which, gotta love a colleague who will help you write it on a napkin. Like we literally wrote it on a napkin and we both did it for like the next 2 weeks. And I had adults who were, in their like middle-aged adults, and I think she was teaching high school students at that time. And we both did it and we shared resources and it was really cool. So what we talked about was just taking the simple sort of statements that are perhaps generic at best and maybe a little stereotypical at worst in novice level classrooms, where we say things like Chinese people eat dumplings. People from Mexico eat tacos, right? We say these things and we're trying to get at the third person plural verb conjugation, or we're trying to use the vocabulary, or we're trying to talk about food. And we don't want to introduce complexity into the language by saying some people sometimes in some places do this thing, but not everybody. It's complicated, you know? So I respect the need for language that's understandable and processable. But we run the risk, right? When our students trust us to be teaching them about other parts of the world, perhaps to which they don't have much exposure and don't have a lot of knowledge, you know, that comes with a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of responsibility to be aware of the stories we're telling and the right we have or don't have to even tell those stories, but then to make sure that we're being part of the solution, not part of the problem. And one of the cool things that we brainstormed that day on the plane back from Portland was, what if we take some of those sentences and we just turn them into questions? We get the same language. We get questions again, which we love. And questions again give you this openness, this, it's okay if I, the teacher, don't know the answer. And I have told rooms full of people, I don't care if you're a quote unquote native speaker or you're a quote unquote non-native speaker. Those terms are a little problematic, but we'll use them for simplicity's sake. Even if you are a native speaker of whatever language, you don't speak for all speakers of that language. You can't possibly
100%.
have lived every life experience. If you're a Spanish speaker, for example, if you're from Chile, you might not know anything about Colombia. So you have no more right in some ways than somebody who grew up in the United States or in England to sort of be the authority, right? But sort of the beauty, and I think a lot of teachers struggle with like, well, what do I do if I don't know? You know, don't I have to know? But what I think the beauty of turning everything into questions is not only modeling intellectual humility, which sounds nice and fancy, but being like, I don't know, and that's fine. Just embracing the I don't know, let's learn, let's figure it out. And I don't know, I think students respond really well to that. So we have our unit that we sort of made together started with people in Mexico eat tacos, and we turned that into, do people in Mexico eat tacos? And then suddenly we had this list of like 20 questions that came from that one, which was like, you know, where do people eat tacos? When do people eat tacos? How do people eat tacos? What is a taco? Is there such a thing as an authentic taco? Is Taco Bell authentic? Is there Taco Bell in Mexico?
Yeah, that's great.
Are tacos expensive? Are they healthy? Do other people in Latin America eat tacos, right? So we had all of these questions that sort of turned into these like daily explorations. And I remember we did it was like a vocab activity, right? With a set of my students, where everybody made a list of like, what is an authentic taco and what is a non-authentic taco to them. And it was really interesting to compare the lists, you know, whose tacos had cheese on them, whose tacos had, you know, cilantro on them, and what kind of tortilla were they in, and what were you basing it on, right? Then we got students who were saying, well, Taco Bell is this way. And somebody's like, well, my neighbor who's from Guadalajara does it this way. When we go to her house for taco night, it's this. And this was a novice level class, right? But we got all of these, it was like a flip grid, and I don't have access to it anymore. I lost the flip grid, and I'm so sad about it because it was one of the coolest things ever. And it just started again with this like Culture Friday from a textbook that was like tacos in Mexico. And I was like, I think it's more complicated than that. Let's turn it into a question, and now let's explore this in our language class. And I don't know, one of the coolest things about this kind of stuff in language classes is you not only get the like, I think often about the many, many people who all of us as language teachers encounter who are like, oh, I took French in high school, but I don't remember any French. And like, on the one hand, I'm like, you're saying it kind of as a joke, but like, you are actually really sad about it, right? Like you're telling me that, and there's regret bubbling up, you know,
so true.
From there. But I think about like, okay, well, what do you remember? You don't remember French, but what do you remember from French class? Do you remember learning about people you didn't know existed? Do you remember feeling excluded because you felt like people who look or sound like you can't speak French, can't use French, are not authentic users of French? Do you remember learning something cool about the world. I don't know.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things is when students come back and they're like telling me about a conversation they had at dinner with a peer, that they're like, I learned this in Spanish class, and the conversation happens in English, right? But they learned, like, knowledge was acquired about the world, about themselves, about something in our language class. And I'm like, that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to be able to do that.
Oh, I agree. I think that just flipping that to the question that you talked about, honestly, is like brilliant. Like, to me, I'm like, that is just amazing, because you're absolutely right. It just changes the whole tone and the whole conversation in so many ways. And I
it's
think
liberating.
Yeah, I like, seriously, like, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, now my mind is like sitting here thinking like, oh my gosh, like, how many ways you can do this. But I think the other thing is, like, often we don't know as teachers how to bring up some of these things, like you said, without like, again, jumping into these kind of generalizations and stereotypes and, just different things. And it's hard to navigate this. And I love the idea that you can just flip the question and you can bring up those things in a natural, organic sort of way, not judgy, not like, I'm going to teach you. And like you said, like, we're not going to now discuss the origin of tacos everywhere. But again, it gives it's a conversation. And I'm sure, like, now everybody is much more, not that tacos aren't intrinsically interesting, but you can do that with anything, right? And again, I also think it takes that, I am the teacher, I am the dispenser of the knowledge of, or the textbook or the novel or whatever, as being the fount of the knowledge, right? And we get to put it on that learner and ask their opinions and what do they think and why don't you find out? And I really think that just flips that perspective on its head.
Some of the coolest things I've seen, I remember Dory Conlon Perugini shared one time, even with elementary school students, I'm like 96% sure it was her. She talked about, finding a meaningful way to do colors, right, as a sort of a topic in a language class. And she talked about framing it in terms of accessibility, like what is high contrast and low contrast? What colors can you pair well together to be visible or to help somebody who's colorblind, make sure they can see the difference? And red and green shouldn't go together.
I love
things
it.
like that. And I was like, whoa, mind blown, brilliant. Like, will steal and use with my college students, because that's something that they do badly on their PowerPoints in every class, right?
Yeah.
Not just in mine. They go do a presentation in a history class and they're using like red on a green background. And I'm like, don't do that. Like that is actually not good. I don't know. There's a scholar who I deeply respect, who's retired now from Georgetown, but who's very, very well known sort of in the genre of instructed SLA. Heidi Burns is her name. She's a German professor and was integral very early in the proficiency movement. And she talks about sort of, at least in the university level, but I think this is true at every level to some extent, about sort of the bifurcated language program, that we have 2 years of contentless language, and then we get 2 years, or perhaps 1 year if it's high school level 1, 2, 3 AP, of almost languageless content, right? And I would challenge anybody in the audience who was like a language major in college, probably means you were a literature major.
Yep.
And like, how much better did your language get when the focus shifted to literature? Probably some, but probably the improvements were incremental, were not intentional, probably were despite the instruction, not because of it. And I think this sort of sacrificing content for language, or sacrificing language for content in the name of being thorough. Like, I totally get it. There are so many, and I was this teacher, and I have so many friends who were these teachers, and some are not anymore and some still are. And, everybody's on this journey differently, but, we want to be thorough, right? We want to teach people well. So we're like, past tense has come up. Now I have to teach you all of the past tense. And it's not to harm you. It's not to overwhelm you. It's not to make you feel dumb. It is because I want what is best for you, which is I want you to be able to communicate about all the things in the past tense. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to do verb conjugations. And we did that from a place of love. Like, I truly do not believe that teachers wake up in the morning ever and go, I want to do a bad job today. I fundamentally don't believe that. I think we do better, and then we know better, and then we do better. But I think when we reframe the conversation to go, you know what, even if I do teach you all the verb conjugations and all the vocabulary on the page 17 of the textbook, you're not going to learn it all, right? That teaching and learning are separate processes. And I ask this question of teachers all the time, which is, can you learn without a teacher? Yes. Can a teacher teach without somebody there to learn? No. So which one of us is here to serve which one of us?
I love that.
Right? Like which one of us has to be here and which one of us gets to be here? And what do we do with that knowledge? Do we make the process of learning more efficient? Like, with me, you can learn more than you could learn without me in the same amount of time. Do we make it more enjoyable? Because learning by yourself, like reading a textbook, is miserable for most people. Do we make it more effective in that, like, we can structure learning in a certain way and give you like a progression? We can give you feedback. We can encourage you, right? I think when we examine our roles as teachers and we realize that we're here to help, then we can ask ourselves, is what we're doing helping? And we can look back at those, like, I was trying to help you by teaching you all the verbs, and go, right, but you didn't learn them all anyway. So by combining language with content and feeling like, but I'm sacrificing a portion of language to do content, the language isn't going to be perfect, whatever. We can pause and go, right, but it never was.
Right.
And this is much more rich, right? Doing both feels like you're only getting some vocabulary and you're only getting some structure and you're only whatever. But the benefit to me, like far, far outweighs the perceived sacrifice. And I don't even think it's a sacrifice, but I used to, and I really did. I used to rebel strongly against this idea of like, we're going to learn knowledge in my Spanish class. I'm like, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to teach you Spanish, much less like have you think about the fact that there's Spanish speaking countries on 4 different continents. But then I go, why? Because you could learn that. And then if you grow up and tell a language teacher in 20 years, I took Spanish in high school, but I forgot it all, maybe you will have at least like learned about the diversity of what is the Spanish speaking world and realize that, that there are people who look like me in every single country in the Spanish speaking world, white, blue eyes, red hair or blonde hair. There are people of African descent in every single Spanish-speaking country. Like Uju Anya has this wonderful book about Black students from the U.S. studying abroad in Brazil and engaging with this entire world that in their Portuguese classes they didn't know anything about, which was that there are Black Portuguese speakers in Brazil, and finally realizing, whoa, this curriculum could include me. It doesn't. I don't know. There's just lots of the content to me is equally, it will draw you or keep you just as much as the language itself will or can. So I think it's worth, thinking about both.
Yeah. Well, and I think, going back to what we talked about originally about not just about brains in general, not novice brains or whatever brains, but again, like when you have authentic language and authentic reasons for learning about this that do make these connections, that is going to prime you for better learning and understanding, so
exactly.
it does increase motivation and interest and engagement and lots of other things as well. So I agree. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah. And I guess building on that a little bit, this one has come up, and this is sort of a hot topic, borderline buzzword, but I think really important and perhaps still quite misunderstood. And I'm not sure we're 100% engaging in the right ways in world languages yet. I think there's this concept of translanguaging, right, has come up, and it really came out of dual language bilingual programs starting kind of in New York City, but all over the US. And it's become a huge thing in sort of the applied linguistics research world as well. But I think the takeaway for world language teachers, to me, because we don't have quite the same, we don't always have quite the same sort of social hierarchy of languages that we're dealing with, in the sense that if you get a kid who grows up speaking Spanish, they go to school at 5, they're in a bilingual program, but suddenly they're not allowed to use their Spanish, or they're punished for the way they use their English, or they're quote unquote mixing languages, and they're being told, no, don't do that, right? We have a different relationship with the sort of the balance of languages, or the target language and the shared language in a world language program. I think, and my thinking on this is definitely still developing, but I think it is really important to remember as world language teachers that our goal isn't monolingualism, right? That isn't the goal. And sometimes I think we tacitly treat it like it is. We're like 90% target language only. I don't understand you. Say that in whatever language. And the kids, like, I've watched kids in classrooms ask their teacher in English, can I go to the bathroom? And the teacher's like, Chinese, please. And I'm like, read the room. Like, this wasn't the moment for that. And again, well-intentioned, right?
Yeah.
I have limited time. I know you know how to use the target language to do that. You get no Chinese outside of this room.
Yeah.
I'm trying to maximize, right? I'm doing my 90%. Like, I'm listening to what Axel says. All of those things, well-intentioned, but impact perhaps is not ideal. So I don't know. I remember listening to this podcast episode of Stacy's podcast, We Teach Languages. It must have been years ago. And Dory actually interviewed Jonathan Drosak, who's a linguistic anthropologist at Stanford. And one of the things he asked, that question sort of like resonated with me in just a really profound way. He sort of reminded us that even bilingualism or multilingualism isn't actually the end point. It's not our goal, in the sense that, and I love people like Dory who talk about this so openly on Twitter, you know, language learning does not by default make you any more empathetic, any more critical thinking, any more
tolerant,
humane, any more anything. None of those things, right? Those are not like, you know, cause and effect relationships. It definitely can happen, and there might even be a correlation between people who learn languages and people who exhibit certain traits in the world. Sure, perhaps, although those traits might not be good ones. I would, you know, remind people that historically, people who engaged in the enslavement, purchase, and sale of humans were multilingual and multicultural. There's a beautiful but heart-wrenching documentary series on Netflix that shows how well people who engaged in enslavement knew the languages and cultures of the people, insofar as being able to give them the right food and talk to them in the right way that would encourage them to go on the Middle Passage, for example. Those were multilinguals, right? So multilingualism isn't the goal, you know, and what Jonathan asked, the question that really struck me was, bilingualism in service to what, right? Like, what is the goal? And if we step back and think, the goal of my language teaching endeavor, sure, is that you learn the language, right? That comes with the territory. But if that's not the only goal, then I think this becomes a much more meaningful enterprise. And I don't know, I think it's really easy to talk about that. I think it's really easy to theorize about that. I think it's easy to say, merge language with content, have students do authentic things, you know, don't promote stereotypes, blah, 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 blah. It's really easy to say all of these things, and it is really hard to do some of them, much less all of them. But I think if we collectively hold one another responsible for that question, to the bilingual, multilingual in service to what, it's easy to then expand beyond borders. For example, I love something Rebecca Bluewolf does on Twitter frequently, is that she shares resources that are in French, but that are not about the French-speaking world. So she shares like something about Chinese New Year or the Lunar New Year in French that then her students will use in French 1, but that has nothing to do with on the surface. Right. It seems like, why would you learn about Chinese culture in France? But then you remember that there's a ton of Chinese people in France, and that there are people in the room who might celebrate the Lunar New Year, right? We talked about Dia de Muertos in my Chinese class this past year, and I had a student come to me and say, I felt so seen because my family celebrates and none of my friends do, so I never talk about it with my friends. And suddenly, like, there I am in a Chinese class of all places.
That's amazing.
Right? You know, I had students this year also come to me and say, in all my years of education as a senior in college, I have never seen a teacher use pictures of people who look like me in a PowerPoint ever. And I'm like, you're 22. Yeah. You have literally been through all of formal education. And for you to, to say this, right, is on the one hand, I feel like, wow, I'm glad I did it. I mean, I'm glad I have had enough people to tell me to be intentional about my choices, and I can always do better too. But at the same time, I'm like, in how many years, right? So I don't know. I think a lot about this conversation that Dory and Jonathan had, and that really pushes me to remember that if multilingualism in and of itself is not the goal, what else are we doing? And what will they take away if some portion of our students, sad though it is to say, will not go on to be regular users of the language? Will they look back and say, I know something about me that I didn't know before. I know somebody about my community that I didn't know before. I know something about the world that I didn't know before. And if the answer is no, I guess I would challenge us to say, why not? Why do we feel like that doesn't have a place in our classroom? This is something I think about.
What I love most about this podcast and talking to people like you is like, we started on one sort of path and it kind of goes in different places where the heart goes, but it's so connected. And so like what I'm thinking back to like, even if this mind shift or mind kind of change, this shift in your mindset and the way you think, even if that's to me is kind of where you start, because you can't find the images that are going to be impactful if you're not thinking beyond the typical, like the what usually is, right? It's a visit to the doctor's office for body parts, and it's ordering at a restaurant, right? And those are the kind of go-to. We've been, that's how I learned it, that's how I taught it, that's our default, right? And it's so hard for our brains to break out of that default. And so if you do ask yourself, like, okay, I'm looking at, we're going to talk about identity, and everybody has the I am tall, I am short. Well, who cares? You can see I'm tall, you can see I'm short, you can see I'm whatever, but when we say, okay, well, what about identity does have meaning that we could bring in, or family, and how could we find images about families that are beyond just a family tree that is, again, typically a certain look to it, perhaps in the textbook. No deep questions can be asked of that picture that is a family tree. But I think infographics that have like, what are the breakdown of families in China, in Mexico, in, Africa, France, whoever, different images of those things, and how that's where we start, say, what is the goal here besides, the obvious, and then how can we ask questions, and how can we engage, our students with those? And I think those are two really powerful things to take away about, the topic we're talking about with novice language.
Yeah, exactly. For me, it's the language, of course, and I will be the first to say, at least the identity that I claim is, I'm a language teacher, and first and foremost, that is how I see myself. I don't, I don't take anything away from anybody else, but I wouldn't call myself first and foremost, a content teacher, for example. That is not how I view my job. But I don't think that those things are antithetical either, right? And so for me, it really is about the learning and the takeaways and the knowledge. And I think all of that opens itself up. Again, I don't think it's cause and effect, direct sort of linearity, but it opens itself up surely to lots of questions and lots of important conversations and important examinations of things like inclusivity and, which topics am I choosing and which areas of these topics, and who is sitting in the room, here. Do they feel seen? Do they feel like this is relevant? Do they feel like, their brains are being engaged? And I've even been doing some really interesting research in preparation for a talk that a professor of mine is going to be giving about, how tests, even big tests, like big standardized tests, disadvantaged people, and this is new to me, not new to the field perhaps, but new to me, in that when tests are not culturally relevant to the test taker, it's actually really hard to get at something like comprehension, because there's a level of assumed knowledge, right, that the person actually doesn't have. And then there's a fairness question and all of these things, right? So, it's kind of a circular logic is the way my brain works, perhaps. But really, I think these things are the critical thinking, the critical awareness, the questioning one's own biases, the creating an inclusive environment. I think these things are all really related and really do have a place sort of at the heart of the conversations that I hope we have in our departments or in our districts or in our schools, where we do kind of curriculum planning and we think about, I have to teach this content, or I want to teach this content. Level 1, sometimes I wonder as a field, I know there's this huge push for, thematic units and all of these things, which I think in intention are great. Sometimes I wonder how far we've actually moved away from textbooks, because we're still like, level 1 is like greetings and families and chimes and dates and hobbies and whatever. And I'm like, just because you repackage it doesn't perhaps mean that it's that different from a textbook. But Rose and I we gave a keynote a few years ago at Flank, and we talked about, this idea of, if I have to teach this language, or I have to teach this whatever, these vocabulary words, can I do it in a way that will prompt, or at least make possible, critical thinking, critical learning, feeling included, seeing oneself represented, wondering something, kind of curiosity about the world, novelty, and I think there's really good research. Donna Clementi and Laura Terrell did a presentation a few years ago at ACTFL that was about, learning in the brain, and how things like novelty, curiosity stimulate learning and make learning more durable. So again, sort of, I totally respect, and I saw a teacher the other day on Twitter say something like, how am I supposed to do anti-bias, anti-racism, 90% target language, be mindful of every single one of my resources, keep track of my 150 students, respond to parent emails, go to staff meetings, live through a pandemic, etc. And so while I love, truly from the bottom of my heart, love the conversations that we have on Twitter, I think it is important to, remind ourselves that this work is really complex. Nobody has everything figured out, and that we know better than we do better, and that it really is an incremental process of trying to find the commonality between these things that sometimes sound really disparate, right? Comprehensible language and interculturality and anti-racism and all of these things that seem like, if I put my energy here, am I sacrificing all these other areas? The truth is, I don't think so, but nobody's going to jump from, all I've ever used is a textbook, and I've never really thought about what is where and why it's that way. And I never actually even took the time to look in the pictures of the textbook and count how many different kinds of people are represented there, and sort of do just a tally of that. To now, I'm going to be the expert in all things.
Decolonize my curriculum, right?
And no, and 100% those things require the expertise of others. And there are so many people in the field who now are finally being recognized for the work that they've been doing in those areas for a long time, decolonization, anti-racism in our curriculum. And so, pay those people, ask those people to come, bring them in for these important conversations, and recognize them for the work that they have also freely shared all over the place. But yeah, I don't know. I think it really boils down to two things. One is it's sort of not insulting the intelligence of your students, right? Remembering that that so often when they're novices, we get this really limited window into who they really are as complex humans, and our interactions can be really limited if we are really like, you must only speak the target language with me, and I really was that way for a while. And I realized how much of my students I was missing, I just realized that, like, I don't know you, you don't know me, and we don't have enough time to, I get 50 hours a semester to get to know these humans. So we're going to do some reflection writing in English. We're going to do a questionnaire at the beginning of the semester in English. We're going to sit down and talk about the pandemic today because everybody's stressed out in English. And you're going to hear a little bit about me, and I'm going to know a little bit more about you. And because monolingualism isn't the goal, I don't feel bad about it. And I used to be like, I can't believe I didn't use 100% target language today. But then I remembered that it's fine.
Yeah.
that nothing bad was going to happen because I chose to be a real human with real humans for a day.
I love that. I think that is, there's so many things that we talked about today that I think are really going to both resonate with teachers, educators, world language people out there, but also challenge a little bit, right? And just, again, just challenge that our ideas of why things are the way they are, and they've always been that way. And I think it is hard to break out of that, and just that idea that, we can start small, bring some different images, ask some questions, get some opinions, do that thing, treat them like they are, they are human beings, that have opinions, and they have words they want to know. They have agendas of why they want to learn a language, and it may not be the same as ours, right? And giving them that choice and that freedom and letting it be okay, is a great place to kind of start.
And a big thing there, honestly, I think one of the, in addition to being open, to change and also open to being wrong, I think that all of us as language learners, right, we remember what it's like to be wrong and to be excited about being wrong and be like, oh, I learned a new thing, right? And then sometimes we get in our like professional spaces and we're like, somebody somewhere thinks I'm an expert. So then I guess then I feel weird about being wrong. And we get in this kind of expert fallacy, right, of like, I should know things. So then somebody tells me, Matt, why did you say that? I disagree. What if you think about it like this? And I'm like, no, I'm an expert. I shouldn't be wrong. But then I'm like, no, you're a language learner. You love being wrong. And you will grow from that experience. So part of it is, right, is that. But I also think, our students know. Like, they will, and the beauty of teaching elementary school kids is they will just tell you. They will say, this is boring.
They are brutal.
I don't understand what we're doing. They are real honest. And then they kind of, as they get socialized into particular behaviors in school and with adults and stuff, sometimes they feel things, but they don't tell you anymore, especially if you don't have that relationship with students. But cultivating those kind of channels for feedback, whether it's exit ticket on a piece of paper, or it's a Google form with a question that says, you try something and just ask them, did they like it? How did they feel about it? Did they learn something this unit besides French that
was valuable?
They think is important and cool and whatever. And because they'll tell you. And if everybody says no, don't take that as I failed, I'm horrible, I should quit. Take that as what can I do differently? What is this information telling me to motivate the next round of changes? Because, I think about curricula, there's kind of two states that a language curriculum is in. It's either in progress or it's in the trash. And we're starting over, right? It's never done. It's never finished. It's never perfect. Like, we change our lessons between first and second block, even if it's the same prep, we change it. And that's fine. This is a, language is, to quote one of my favorite scholars, is a complex, open, dynamic system. So teaching is too, right? There is no one size fits all. And if anybody tells you there is, I would say, don't be friends with that person, because this is far too complicated to be that easy. Doubt. So be open to the critical thinking and conversations that we want our students to have. We can
and to start someplace, right? And wherever that is.
Exactly. What is it? There's a quote that somebody used in a PD I was in once, and I loved it. It's you don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great.
Exactly. That's awesome. Like, I should put that on my wall, right? That is true. That is.
Exactly. It is on my wall, actually. It is on a sticky note.
Great. Well, I love this conversation. I really appreciate I think we could talk like all day, right? I mean, I've really enjoyed this, and I hope people have enjoyed listening to this.
Me too.
What are you on Twitter? I know you're very active. What's your handle on Twitter? We're going to make sure we put that in there.
My Twitter is at Matt Laoshi, Laoshi. That's Chinese teacher. It's what my 4-year-olds at elementary school used to call me.
I love it. And we'll put it in the show notes as well. And I know you would love to engage with people online as well.
Yes.
And hopefully we can see each other live and in person at AATSP. So in Puerto Rico.
Yes,
so
we will
absolutely
make that happen.
Have a coffee in person or something. So thank you again so much for coming. I have just loved talking with you, Matt. Thank you so much for all of your insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me.